Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into a universal human experience, fear. We've compiled a ton of really interesting information from scientific studies, expert opinions, and even historical accounts. So to really kick things off, try to imagine this. You're sitting calmly, but inside you feel like your body is going haywire, like some kind of internal storm of fear is brewing.
That's a really great way to describe how fear, while processed in the brain, can manifest in these physical sensations all over our body. It's kind of like your body's way of preparing for a threat, even if, you aren't consciously aware of it.
So it's like our body has its own language for fear. All these physical signs, tense muscles, a racing heart, maybe you break out in a sweat. Are these like signals that something's not right?
Yeah, exactly. It's this deeply ingrained response. Like, picture our ancestors. They're in the wild. They come face to face with a predator. Well, their bodies needed to react immediately, right? And that meant preparing to fight or flee. And this is where the sympathetic nervous system steps in, basically orchestrating that primal response.
So is that the same system that helped our ancestors, run from saber-toothed tigers? Is that the same one that kicks in when we have to give a presentation at work? Because, I don't know, that doesn't seem quite as helpful in a boardroom.
You're exactly right. These reactions, while super important for survival in the past, they don't always serve us well in our modern lives. Think about it. Public speaking, job interviews, even navigating certain social situations. And here's what's even more concerning. When this stress response becomes chronic, it can have detrimental consequences for our health. Increased risk of heart disease, compromised immunity, and even premature aging. The mind-body connection is definitely something we can't ignore.
That's pretty sobering. That chronic stress can really impact our physical well-being like that. But let's go back a little bit. Where does fear come from in the first place? Are we talking nature or nurture? Are we hardwired to be afraid of certain things, or is it more about our experiences?
Well, it's a fascinating combination of both, actually. Some fears are innate, potentially like embedded in our genes. Like, think about the common fears of snakes or heights, even darkness. These were all very real threats to our ancestors. And the preparedness theory, well, it proposes that we might actually be predisposed to fearing things that were dangerous to them, even if we've never actually encountered them personally.
So even if we've never had a bad experience with a snake, let's say, in the wild, we could still have this instinctual aversion to them, like it's a built-in alarm system from generations past.
Exactly. It's almost like some ancient wisdom whispering, be careful. But then we also, acquire fears through our own experiences. This is where the whole idea of learned fears comes in. And one of the most, I guess you could say, famous examples of this is Pavlovian conditioning. This is where we learn to associate something neutral with something that's either unpleasant or scary.
Ah, yes. Pavlov's dogs. That classic experiment where they learn to associate a bell with food. I'm guessing you're going to tell me humans aren't that different from those canine subjects.
You got it. We learn fear in a very similar way. Imagine a mouse that repeatedly hears a specific sound and then it gets a mild electric shock. Well, over time, that mouse is going to start showing fear even when the sound is presented all by itself. It's learned to associate that sound with something unpleasant.
Okay, so that makes sense with a mouse, but are human brains really working on the same principle?
Research actually says absolutely. Studies have shown that fear learning can even happen subconsciously. Like, participants were shown these masked images they couldn't consciously see, and those images were paired with a mild electric shock. And what was amazing was their bodies still developed a fear response to those masked images, even though they weren't even aware they'd seen them.
That's a little creepy. Are brains learning to be afraid without us even knowing? Like some hidden fear factory operating under the surface?
It really emphasizes how powerful and sometimes kind of scary the subconscious is in learning to be afraid. And then there's another thing. Once a fear is learned, it can actually spread to situations that are similar. It's called fear generalization. Let's go back to the example of a child bitten by a dog. That child may then develop a fear of all dogs, even really friendly ones. It's like their brain is saying, better safe than sorry.
Right, so their brain's kind of casting a wider net of fear, grabbing anything that even vaguely resembles the original source of danger. But if we can learn fear so easily, can we also learn to feel safe? Like, can our brains undo these associations with fear?
Of course. Our brains are incredibly adaptable, and that includes learning how to feel safe. This happens through something called extinction learning. Remember the mouse. If we just keep playing that sound without the electric shock, the mouse's fear response will slowly decrease.
So repeated exposure to the scary thing without anything bad happening helps the brain realize, oh, this isn't actually a threat.
Exactly. The brain rewires itself to associate that stimulus with safety instead of danger. And this, it involves complex brain regions like the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. They're really important in inhibiting the amygdala's fear response. Basically, they act like these rational mediators, overriding that fear response with information about the context.
So it's like having this level-headed friend in your brain saying, hey, chill out. That lion at the zoo, it's behind a thin glass wall. It can't hurt you.
I like that. That's a great way to put it. And it's important to note that those fear memories, they aren't completely erased. It's more like they're kind of overshadowed by newer and stronger safety memories.
This is where it gets interesting. We've been talking about how our brains are wired to learn fear, to avoid danger. But then why do we go out of our way to seek out scary things like horror movies or roller coasters? It just seems counterintuitive.
It really is an interesting paradox. The thing is, our brains can tell the difference between real danger and perceived danger. When we're really into a horror movie, our, let's say, lower brain, which includes the amygdala, might still react with a fear response, but at the same time, our logical frontal cortex is saying, relax, it's just a movie, you're safe.
So we're basically getting the thrill of a fear response,
Yeah.
but without the actual terror of being in real danger, like a carefully measured dose of adrenaline.
Exactly. It's all about this balance, the balance between that fear response and the control that the frontal cortex gives us. And that balance determines whether a scary experience is fun or completely overwhelming. Think about a haunted house. We know it's not real, but we still get a rush from the spooky atmosphere and the jump scares. But if suddenly we felt we were in real danger, poof, the fun's gone.
Makes sense. We enjoy being scared, but only within certain limits. Is there an evolutionary reason why we do that, though? Why would we have evolved to seek out something inherently unpleasant?
There are some theories, and they're pretty fascinating. They suggest that seeking out fear, but in a safe environment, could be our way of practicing how to be alert and practicing how to solve problems. A kind of mental workout to get us ready for potential threats in the real world. Imagine our ancestors. They're sitting around a fire listening to stories about dangerous animals or enemy tribes. Those stories, while scary, could have helped them figure out ways to survive.
I see. So maybe our love for horror movies is really just a leftover survival mechanism, a way to keep our minds sharp, our instincts honed. But what about courage? That seems like the opposite of fear. Are some people just born brave? Or is there something more to it?
Courage. It's often seen as this ideal, but it's not just about not being afraid. It's more about the ability to act even though you are afraid. And there are a bunch of things that impact how we see and deal with fear.
So it's not as simple as you're either fearless or you're a coward. There's more nuance to it.
Way more. One big thing is threat perception. How we interpret a threat, it's different from person to person. Even in the exact same situation. Our knowledge and our experiences, they play a huge role. Think about someone who's a zoologist. They see a wild animal. Well, they understand animal behavior. They're probably going to feel less threatened than someone who, doesn't have that expertise.
Right. So knowing more about a situation can actually reduce fear. It's about replacing, like this blind anxiety, with actual knowledge, with awareness.
Absolutely. It's about realistically understanding the danger. Another important factor is skill. Knowing how to handle a situation, that can really decrease fear. Look at medical professionals. As doctors get more experience, as they hone their skills, they become much more confident in dealing with emergencies.
The more skilled you are, the less intimidated you feel by a challenge. It's about feeling competent, in control.
Exactly. And last but not least, the meaning we give to a situation. The purpose we see in it can really affect how we experience fear.
Meaning and purpose. How does that tie into our fear response?
Well, let's think about soldiers in combat. Imagine one soldier fighting to protect their home for a cause they truly believe in. They might experience fear differently than, say, a soldier fighting for something they don't support. The meaning they attach to that situation, it really shapes their emotional experience.
Makes sense. If you strongly believe in what you're fighting for, you're more likely to overcome that fear. It's not just about the physical danger. It's also about what that situation means to you, emotionally and psychologically.
Precisely. And this leads us to a really fascinating area. The interplay between fear and aggression. We often think of aggressive people as being fearless, but a lot of times that aggression is actually fueled by fear.
Wait, really? Someone who seems aggressive might actually be driven by fear deep down. That seems counterintuitive.
It might seem strange, but it's a very common thing. Take a dictator who rules with an iron fist. Their aggression might be because they're terrified of losing power, of losing control. What's interesting is that fear and anger actually activate similar areas in the brain, especially the amygdala, and they trigger very similar physical responses.
So they both activate our primal fight or flight system. They're like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. And this highlights the close link between those two powerful emotions. Here's another crucial point. Being exposed to violence, whether you're the victim or a witness, it can have long-lasting effects on your brain, making you more prone to fear and anxiety even when the threat is gone.
So even when a dangerous situation is over, the experience of that violence can stick with us, making us more fearful down the road.
Unfortunately, yes, it can lead to a heightened sense of threat, pervasive anxiety, even a constant state of alertness, like your brain's stuck on high alert, always looking for danger, even when things are safe.
That's something to think about. But let's shift gears for a minute. Let's talk about anxiety disorders. When does fear cross the line from a normal emotion to a debilitating disorder?
Well, fear becomes a problem when it doesn't match the actual threat. And when it starts interfering with our daily lives. Anxiety disorders are marked by this excess of fear and anxiety. It causes significant distress and really impairs our ability to function, affecting our relationships, our work, just our overall well-being.
So it's not just about feeling anxious sometimes. It's about anxiety that's so strong and persistent that it prevents you from living normally.
Precisely. And there are all sorts of anxiety disorders, each with their own unique features and triggers. It might be helpful to dive into some of the most common ones.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think a lot of people deal with anxiety in some form, so understanding the different types could help us understand our own experiences better.
Absolutely. Let's start with specific phobias. These are irrational fears of very specific things or situations, like spiders, heights, enclosed spaces.
Like the example we talked about earlier, the child who developed a fear of all dogs because of one bite.
Exactly. How much this impacts someone's life depends on how often they encounter the thing they're afraid of. If someone is terrified of snakes, but lives somewhere without many snakes, well, it might not affect them much. But if you're afraid of something you encounter all the time, that can be really, really tough.
Makes sense. It all depends on the context and how that phobia affects a person's daily life. What about other types of anxiety disorders? What are some common ones?
Social phobia, it's also called social anxiety disorder. It's incredibly common. Basically, it's this intense fear of social situations and the possibility of being judged or scrutinized by others. People with social phobia often avoid social gatherings or interactions altogether.
So it's more than just being shy or introverted. It's a fear that can really get in the way of someone's social life, their relationships.
Exactly. It can prevent people from going after what they want, from building meaningful connections, from really fully participating in life. Another common one is panic disorder, and this involves sudden, unexpected episodes of intense fear. Panic attacks. They come with physical symptoms like racing heart, shortness of breath, dizziness, even a sense of impending doom.
I've heard people describe panic attacks as feeling like a heart attack. They can
Yeah.
be terrifying. And then people end up afraid of having another attack, which ends up limiting what they do even more.
You're right. The fear of another attack can become a vicious cycle. People might avoid places or situations where they've had an attack before. There's also generalized anxiety disorder, or JAD.
What does GAD look like?
People with JAD worry a lot, and about lots of things, everyday things, their health, their money, their job, their family. And this worry is, well, it's hard to control. It can even show up as physical symptoms like muscle tension, fatigue, and trouble sleeping.
So it's like this worry takes over their thoughts, their energy.
Yeah.
It makes it hard to relax or focus on anything else.
Exactly. It colors how they see the world, and it makes it really hard to feel happy or peaceful. And then there's obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD.
I hear the term OCD thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean?
OCD involves obsessions, which are these intrusive thoughts, images, or urges that cause a lot of distress, and compulsions, which are repetitive behaviors or mental acts that people feel they have to do in response to those obsessions.
So it's like a cycle. Unwanted thoughts and then rituals that people feel like they have to perform to relieve the anxiety.
Exactly. Common obsessions are things like fear of contamination, fear of harming someone, or fear of making a mistake. And the compulsions can be things like excessive washing, checking, or counting.
All these anxiety disorders, they sound incredibly difficult to live with.
They can be, but it's important to remember they're treatable. With the right therapy and sometimes medication, people can learn to manage their anxiety and live fulfilling lives.
That's good to hear. Now let's switch gears again and talk about trauma. How is a traumatic experience different from just regular everyday stress or fear?
Trauma, well, it's defined as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. But it goes beyond personal experience. It can be witnessing a traumatic event happening to someone else, or even learning about a loved one's trauma.
So trauma involves events that are deeply disturbing
Yeah.
and that can really shatter our sense of safety and security.
Exactly. And the impact can be really profound, really lasting. One possible outcome of trauma is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD.
What are the signs of PTSD?
People with PTSD, they often relive the event through intrusive memories, nightmares, or flashbacks. They might avoid anything that reminds them of the trauma, experience negative thoughts and feelings, and they may be easily startled or have trouble sleeping.
So trauma can basically haunt someone long after the event is over.
Yes, the memories and emotions associated with the trauma, they can linger, and they can have a huge impact on their lives.
That's incredibly tough. Does everyone who experiences trauma develop PTSD?
No, not everyone. Some people have symptoms that are temporary and gradually fade. Others are very resilient, and they experience very few long-term effects.
So how we respond to trauma is different for everyone.
Absolutely. How severe the trauma was, whether someone has social support and their individual coping mechanisms, all these things play a role in how they're affected by trauma.
What are some examples of traumatic events that can cause PTSD?
Things like war, combat, terrorist attacks, physical or sexual assault, serious accidents, and natural disasters. All of these can have lasting impacts on both mental and physical health.
So trauma can affect anyone, no matter their background or experiences.
Precisely. It's a human experience, and it's important to realize that trauma can happen in many different situations.
And PTSD, it's treatable too, right?
Yes. Therapy, especially those focused on trauma and sometimes medication, can help people process the trauma, cope with symptoms, and regain a sense of control over their lives.
That's good to know. Now let's talk about media. It seems like we're constantly bombarded with negative news and stories designed to scare us. How does this affect our anxiety?
The media plays a big role in shaping how we see the world, and that includes how we see danger and risk.
And it seems like, especially in the U.S., the media, particularly cable news, tends to focus on negative and frightening content. Why is that?
Well, the U.S. media landscape, it's very competitive, and news outlets, they often prioritize things that are sensational, things that will get people emotional. That's how they attract viewers. And fear is a powerful emotion. It grabs our attention, so it's often used to boost ratings.
So it's not necessarily about providing accurate information or balanced reporting. It's more about getting people to watch and keep watching.
Unfortunately, that's often the case. This constant stream of negative news can actually create a very distorted view of the world, making us feel like we're constantly in danger, even when the actual risks are pretty low.
It's like creating this culture of fear, where we're always on edge, waiting for the next bad thing to happen.
Exactly. And this constant negativity can really take a toll on our mental well-being. It makes us more anxious, and it's hard to feel safe or secure.
This reminds me of something I noticed a while back. I was listening to a BBC report about a terrorist attack in London, and the report was very factual, very neutral, no dramatic language. But then I turned on CNN and Fox News, and their coverage was completely different, full of emotion, a sense of urgency. It felt like they were trying to make people afraid, to make them angry, instead of just reporting the facts.
That's a great example of how different media outlets can frame the same event in such different ways. The kind of emotional reporting you see on U.S. cable news, it can really heighten fear and anxiety, making us feel more vulnerable, more threatened.
And this us versus them mentality that a lot of news outlets promote, that just adds to the fear and division, right?
Absolutely. It's classic tribalism, creating an in-group and an out-group, where the out-group is always portrayed as dangerous and threatening.
And then this tribalism is just amplified by social media, where algorithms personalize our news feeds, creating these echo chambers where we only see things that confirm our beliefs, right?
Exactly. Those algorithms, they're designed to keep us engaged. And they do that by showing us stuff that aligns with our existing interests and views. And that can create these digital tribes where we're mostly exposed to information that agrees with us, making it hard to even encounter other perspectives. And that makes us less inclined to, even question what we believe or consider other points of view. It's like being surrounded by mirrors. You just see your own beliefs reflected back at you. And that gives you a distorted perception of what's really out there.
It's like we're living in these bubbles, information bubbles, where everybody agrees with each other and any voices that disagree are just filtered out. It sounds like a recipe for extremism. for intolerance.
Yeah. You're spot on. It's called digital inbreeding, and it can lead to this polarized view of the world where you just can't have a real conversation with anyone who sees things differently. It can also make our fears worse because we're constantly being exposed to the worst case scenarios and these really alarming narratives.
So how do we get out of these echo chambers? How do we develop a more balanced and accurate understanding of the world? How do we become better at filtering the information we're taking in?
That's a critical question, especially with how media works today. The first step is simply being aware, recognizing how these algorithms work, and then making deliberate choices about what we consume. We need to branch out, diversify our news sources, and actively seek out perspectives that challenge our own.
So it's not just about passively taking in what the algorithms feed us. It's about being more proactive, about being curious and willing to engage with viewpoints that are different from ours.
Exactly. It's about having meaningful conversations with people who hold different views, even if we don't agree with them. It's about understanding each other, empathizing, even across those ideological divides.
And probably just being more critical of what we see online, not taking everything at face value, but really looking at the source, considering any potential biases and evaluating the evidence that's being presented.
Absolutely. Critical thinking skills are crucial, especially in the digital age. We have to become really savvy about the media we consume. We have to be able to break down information, spot manipulative tactics, and tell the difference between fact and fiction.
So being more mindful of how information is presented, not letting our emotions get hijacked by those scary headlines, those sensationalized stories. It's about taking back our power as consumers of information.
Precisely. And it's important to be aware of our media habits. We don't need to be constantly bombarded with bad news. It's okay to take a break from the 24/7 news cycle, to focus on things that bring us joy, things that nurture our mental well-being.
So being choosy about what we consume, prioritizing our mental health over drama and fear-mongering. This is all really good advice for dealing with fear in general, not just the kind amplified by media. So speaking of dealing with fear, what are some practical things we can do to become more resilient? Are there tools or techniques that can help us navigate our fear response better?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing is to understand the nature of the fear. Is it coming from a real threat, or is it driven by anxiety, by misinformation, by past experiences?
So figuring out what's real and what's not, what's rational and what's irrational, getting to the root of the fear.
Exactly. Once we've done that, we can start to challenge and reframe those negative thoughts that are making our anxiety worse.
You mentioned reframing negative thoughts. Is it really as simple as just telling ourselves to think positive? How do we actually do that?
It's more than just positive thinking. It's about looking at whether our fearful thoughts are actually true and then replacing them with more realistic and empowering perspectives. Cognitive reappraisal, which is something that's used a lot in therapy, well, it's about reinterpreting the meaning of a situation to change how we feel about it. For example, someone who's terrified of public speaking, they might reframe that fear by focusing on the chance to share what they know, to connect with the audience, instead of dwelling on the possibility of being judged.
So it's about shifting the focus away from the negative and towards the positive, from the threat to the opportunity, finding a better way to see the situation.
Exactly. It's about consciously choosing a perspective that empowers us instead of letting fear paralyze us.
That reminds me of the movie Life is Beautiful, where a father protects his son from the horrors of a concentration camp by making it all seem like a big game.
That's a powerful example of how reframing can drastically change how we feel, even in the most awful situations. It shows the strength of the human spirit and our ability to find hope, even in the darkest of times.
It really underscores how much power our thoughts have in shaping our reality, even when that reality seems incredibly grim.
Exactly. And research has actually proven that cognitive reappraisal can change how our brains function. There have been studies that show when people reappraise negative emotions, there's increased activity in their prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that regulates emotions. So changing our thoughts, it can actually change how our brains respond to fear.
That's incredible. We can literally rewire our brains to be less afraid. That's really empowering.
You could say that. With practice and effort, we can train our brains to handle fear in a way that's more adaptive, more resilient.
So it's not about eliminating fear completely, but more about mastering it so it doesn't run our lives. It's about taking the energy of fear and turning it into something positive.
Exactly. Fear is a natural human emotion, and it can be a powerful force for growth and change.
You mentioned fear as a motivator. Can you talk more about that? How can fear actually be a positive force?
Imagine someone who's stuck in a bad relationship. The fear of staying in that toxic situation might be the very thing that gives them the courage to leave, to find a healthier, happier connection. Or think about the fear of failure. That can push us to achieve great things, to go beyond our comfort zones and
So
excel.
it's about using that fear, channeling that energy into action, letting it propel us forward instead of holding us back.
Exactly. And sometimes the best way to overcome our fears is to face them head on.
Like with exposure therapy.
Right. Exposure therapy involves gradually exposing people to the things they fear in a safe and controlled environment.
So through repeated exposure, they realize that the thing they're afraid of isn't as dangerous as they thought.
Exactly. This can lead to habituation where the fear response just fades over time. It's like desensitizing ourselves to the triggers.
Like teaching our brains to be less reactive.
Exactly. And that brings us back to optimal arousal, something we talked about a bit earlier.
Remind me about optimal arousal. How does that relate to fear management?
It's about finding that perfect balance between being too relaxed and too anxious. We need a certain level of arousal to be motivated and engaged, but too much, and it actually impairs how well we function. Imagine an athlete playing in a really important game. They need to be focused, alert, but if they're too anxious, they won't play well.
So it's about that balance between being motivated and being crippled by anxiety, finding that zone where you're energized but not overwhelmed by fear.
Exactly. And that balance, it's not just for athletes, it's important for everything in life.
So how do we find that optimal level? Is there a one-size-fits-all approach, or does it depend on the person?
It definitely varies. It depends on the individual and the situation. Finding that sweet spot often involves trying things out and being aware of how you're feeling. Things like mindfulness, relaxation techniques, and cognitive reframing, these can help us regulate our emotions and get to that balanced state.
So it's about having a toolbox of strategies to manage anxiety, to keep fear in check. It's about self-awareness and practicing things that promote emotional regulation.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, seeking professional help, it's a sign of strength, not weakness. If fear or anxiety is really affecting your life, talking to a therapist or a mental health professional, they can give you the support and guidance you need to overcome those challenges and improve your well-being.
It's like having a coach to help you train your brain, to be more resilient, more resourceful in the face of fear.
I like that. And just like physical training, mental training takes time, it takes effort, and it takes consistency. But with the right tools and support, we can all get better at navigating this complex world of fear.
And as you said earlier, fear, while often unpleasant, is not always a bad thing. It can actually be a really strong motivator for positive change and even a source of excitement and fun if it's in a controlled setting.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding how fear works,
Yeah.
how it affects our thoughts and behaviors, and then developing good strategies to manage it. Fear can be a teacher, a guide, and even a source of strength if we know how to use it wisely.
This has been a truly insightful exploration of fear. We've talked about the biology behind it, the impact of trauma, the media's influence on how we perceive fear, and the complicated relationship between fear and aggression. And we've looked at a range of practical tools and techniques for managing fear and building resilience.
It really has been a fascinating look at fear from all these different angles.
As we wrap up this deep dive into fear, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier, the fact that fear is universal. We all experience it in one way or another throughout our lives. But as we've been discussing, it's not fear itself that defines us. It's how we make sense of it, how we understand it, and how we ultimately choose to handle it.
I'd like to encourage you, our listener, to just take a minute and reflect on your own experiences with fear. Think about, what are your triggers? The things that really set off that fear response?
Yeah.
How do you typically react when you're afraid? And what are the things that shape how you see danger? By getting to know our own patterns, our own individual responses, well, we can start to develop strategies that work for us, strategies for navigating fear and becoming more resilient.
It's like becoming a student of our own fear,
Okay.
really digging into how our minds and emotions work. And I think one of the most, I guess you could say, empowering takeaways from today is this. We have the power to shape our own experiences, our emotional experiences. If fear is often based on how we interpret things, well, then we can change that interpretation. We can change how we react to situations that feel threatening.
Exactly. We're not just, puppets of our emotions. We have so many tools and techniques we can use to manage fear, to challenge those negative thoughts, and to cultivate a mindset that's more resilient. more
Hmm.
courageous.
So it's not about living a life without fear, but about living a life where we're, I don't know, fear-wise, where we understand it, respect its power, but we don't let it control us.
That's a great way to put it. As we finish up our deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. If fear is so often tied to our own interpretation, well, what does that mean for our ability to create a world that's less fearful? A world that's braver, more compassionate?
That's a really powerful question, one that definitely gives us all something to ponder. And on that note, we'll wrap up our exploration of fear. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you've gained some valuable insights into the many faces of fear and that you feel better equipped to face your own fears with wisdom, resilience, and a sense of empowerment.
And keep in mind, while fear can seem daunting, it's really about understanding and mastering it. That's what lights the way to a more fulfilling life, a more courageous life.
That's a great point. And before we go, just to recap all the fascinating things we've discussed about fear, here's a 10-point summary. Number one, fear is a primal response that starts in the brain but affects our whole body, preparing us to either fight or run. Number two, we inherit some fears from our ancestors, but we also learn fears through our experiences, sometimes even without realizing it. Number three, our brains are amazing. They can learn to feel safe when we're repeatedly exposed to something we fear, but nothing bad happens. Number four, sometimes we actually seek out scary experiences in safe environments, maybe as a way to practice staying alert and problem solving. Number five, true courage isn't about being fearless, it's about acting in spite of fear. And that's influenced by how we perceive the threat, our skills, and what that situation means to us personally. Number six, fear and aggression are closely linked. They activate the same brain areas and trigger similar responses in our bodies. Number seven, anxiety disorders happen when fear and anxiety are excessive and start interfering with our daily lives, and there are different types, like phobias, social anxiety, and panic disorder. Number eight, trauma, things like violence or life-threatening events, can have long-term effects on our mental health, and in some cases can lead to PTSD. Number nine, media, especially here in the U.S., often makes things seem scarier than they are, which can distort how we see the world. And number 10, those algorithms on social media can create echo chambers where we only see information that confirms our existing beliefs, which can make us less tolerant and more fearful of anything that's different. So that's it for our deep dive on fear. Thanks for listening, everyone.